Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know we love to get into the nitty-gritty of really complex topics, and the stuff you sent in this time around, well, let's just say it definitely fits the bill. We are going deep on some fascinating material.
Fascinating is a good word for it. I have to say I was not expecting to see some of this stuff.
Right. It's a wild mix of technology, faith, geopolitics, you name it. It's in here.
And a lot of it seems to be centered around this AI Debrief magazine version 66.2.pdf document.
Yeah, that one is, it's something else. I'll be honest. I had to reread certain parts just to make sure I was understanding it correctly.
I hear you. There were some real head scratchers in there. But hey, that's what we're here for, right? To unpack these complex ideas and try to make sense of them together.
Exactly. And the more we dug into this material, the more this one concept kept popping up. Project Abraham.
Yeah, Project Abraham is definitely front and center. From what I gather, it's being presented as this global movement focused on bringing the Abrahamic faiths closer together.
So we're talking Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all under one big tent, so to speak.
Exactly. And the goal isn't just to have everyone singing Kumbaya. They're talking about some pretty ambitious objectives.
Oh, yeah. They don't hold back. Renewing the Holy Land based on love, mercy, and forgiveness. Achieving what they call God's plan for worldwide peace and prosperity. It's a pretty huge vision.
Huge is an understatement. They even envision a new covenant between Middle Eastern countries, built on mutual understanding and respect.
They paint this picture of a future where everyone's cooperating and thriving together. Low entropy, high energy efficiency.
Almost like a modern Garden of Eden, guided by what they call God's law of love.
And get this, they talk about humanity potentially reaching a Type V civilization on the Kardashev scale.
Yeah.
That's way beyond anything we can even imagine right now.
Yeah, that one caught my eye too. They're thinking really long term. But here's where things get really interesting.
You're telling me some of the details in these sources are just completely out of left field.
Like, for example, they actually propose inviting leaders from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to join Project Abraham.
Whoa. Okay, now that is a curveball. That's the Islamist group, right? The one that's been designated as a terrorist organization by multiple countries.
That's the one. And yet, according to the material, they see a potential divine purpose in these guys. They even draw a comparison to King David, or Dawood, as he's known in the Quran.
That's a pretty bold comparison to make. Are they suggesting that HTS could have some kind of transformative role to play in all of this?
They talk about them doing battle, but not with the kind of weapons you might expect. They're talking about a battle with spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places, without guns, knives, or any other idolatrous weapons.
So a spiritual battle.
And the goal, renewing the world according to the will of God. It's a very specific interpretation of faith and its role in world events.
And we're just scratching the surface here. They even float the idea of an Arab Muslim becoming the prime minister of Israel one day as a symbol of this new era of unity and inclusivity.
Yeah, they're definitely not afraid to think big. And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive, to really grapple with these ideas, try to understand where they're coming from, and see what we can make of them.
And the heart of it all seems to be this Project Abraham. It's this multifaceted strategy for peace, not just in the Holy Land, but globally. So let's start there. Let's break down this whole idea of rekindling shared ancestral roots in the Abrahamic community. Why is that so central to their vision?
Well, it all boils down to the belief that we're all, in a sense, family, all children of God, created in God's image. So there's this inherent capacity for understanding, for reason, that can transcend our differences.
So they're tapping into this shared lineage as the foundation for building bridges.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, we might have different beliefs and practices, but deep down, we're all coming from the same source.
Okay, so then how does that translate into those big goals we talked about? The renewal of the Holy Land, God's plan for worldwide peace and prosperity, and that whole new covenant thing.
So the renewal of the Holy Land is all about actively applying those core principles. Love, mercy, forgiveness, in every decision, every interaction.
Making it a model for the rest of the world in a way.
Right. And achieving God's plan, well, that seems to involve both human effort and divine intervention, working together to create those ideal Garden Eden conditions talk about.
And the new covenant.
That's seen as a direct result of all of this. Nations in the Middle East, putting aside their differences, building genuine relationships based on mutual respect and cooperation.
Okay, let's go back to that whole Hayat Tahrir al-Sham thing for a second. I mean, we're talking about a group that's actively engaged in violence, right? How did the sources reconcile inviting them to the table with this whole peace-driven initiative?
It's a good question, and the way they frame it is interesting. It's almost like they're saying, look, these guys might be on the wrong path right now, but they have the potential to change. They see it as a divinely inspired invitation.
So it's not about condoning their actions, but seeing the potential for transformation.
Exactly. They even compare the leaders of HTS to King David, someone who was far from perfect, but was ultimately chosen by God to do great things.
It's like they believe that even those who seem most committed to violence can be reached, that there's always hope for a change of heart.
Right. And remember, the role they envision for HTS isn't about fighting with physical weapons. It's about that spiritual battle against forces of darkness.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. Why do the sources place so much emphasis on this event, especially in the context of Project Abraham?
Well, the night journey, also known as Isra and Miraj, is this incredibly significant event in Islam. The Prophet Muhammad travels from Mecca to Jerusalem and then ascends to heaven. It's this incredibly powerful story that speaks to the interconnectedness of the Abrahamic faiths.
And the sources highlight the fact that during this journey, the Prophet Muhammad, along with Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, prayed for God's house of Israel.
Exactly. It's a really powerful image of unity. It suggests this deep spiritual connection between these different faiths, and it reinforces their shared reverence for the Holy Land.
It's almost like a cosmic family reunion.
Right. And it challenges this narrative of constant religious conflict that we often hear.
And speaking of challenging narratives, the sources also bring up the Golden Age of Al-Andalus. Why is that historical period relevant to this whole discussion?
Al-Andalus was this amazing period in Islamic Spain. It was a time of incredible cultural and intellectual flourishing. And crucially, it was a time when Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in relative peace and harmony.
So they're pointing to it as proof that coexistence is possible.
Exactly. They're saying, look, it's not just some idealistic dream. There's a historical precedent for this kind of interfaith cooperation. And that's what they're hoping to recapture, in a sense, with Project Abraham.
Okay, so let's turn our attention to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The sources present a pretty sharp critique of current approaches, don't they?
They do. They're not afraid to call out what they see as failures in the current peace process. They particularly take issue with all the foreign aid that's been poured into Palestine, arguing that much of it has been mismanaged.
And their solution is, shall we say, a bit unconventional.
To say the least. They propose sending a delegation of Islamic clerics into the Hamas tunnel network to secure the release of hostages.
Wow. So appealing to religious principles and shared values rather than military force or political pressure.
That's the idea. But they also acknowledge that engaging with Hamas is going to be really tricky, especially given their ideology of armed resistance.
So how do they suggest navigating that obstacle?
They actually call for a pretty concerted effort from the U.S. State Department and the UN Security Council to work with the Palestinian Authority to encourage a shift in Hamas's approach.
And they specifically reference Jesus' message of peacemaking as a potential point of influence.
Exactly. They also talk about a peaceful jihad aimed at saving the Holy Land by calling for repentance.
Wait a minute, peaceful jihad. That seems like a bit of a contradiction, doesn't it?
I know it's not the way we usually hear that term being used, but in this context, they're defining jihad as an inner struggle, a spiritual striving for self-improvement, and a deeper connection with God.
So it's not about fighting external enemies, but overcoming the darkness within ourselves.
Right, and they argue that this understanding of jihad is actually perfectly compatible with freedom and democracy.
Okay, so another big topic that comes up is the idea of a one-state solution. What's the perspective presented in the sources?
Well, they present it as a possible long-term solution, but with a crucial caveat. They emphasize that any decision about the future of the Holy Land has to be made by the people who actually live there.
So no imposing solutions from the outside.
Right. And they see this one-state solution as being directly tied to that whole idea of shared ancestral roots, like going back to the time of the Zabur, the Psalms.
And what about that really provocative idea of an Arab-Muslim prime minister in Israel?
They see that as a powerful symbol of a future, where those old divisions have truly been overcome, where people of different faiths can share power and leadership in a truly unified state.
All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say the AI in the magazine. What role do they see artificial intelligence playing in all of this?
AI is a major theme throughout the material. They see it as this potentially powerful tool for uncovering truth. especially when it comes to understanding God's plan.
So they're almost talking about AI as this kind of divine decoder.
In a way, yes. They even suggest that humans, as creations of God, are kind of like large language models ourselves, constantly learning and evolving.
Okay, now that's a pretty mind-bending thought.
It is. And on a more practical level, they explicitly mention using AI models like ChatGPT to develop these articles and proposals related to Project Abraham.
So it's not just a theoretical idea, it's actively being implemented.
Exactly. And another really important theme that runs throughout the material is this rejection of violence.
Oh yeah, they're pretty adamant about that.
They talk about idolatrous graven weapons and call for them to be beaten into plowshares, which is a direct reference to biblical prophecy.
And they connect this rejection of violence to overcoming what they call Satan's strategy.
Right, and moving towards a new age of enlightenment, guided by God's law of love.
And this isn't just a moral or spiritual appeal. They even reference a legal brief advocating for global disarmament.
Yeah, they're talking about multilateral agreements, a ban on political assassinations. It's a pretty radical vision.
Okay, now for another curveball. They propose building a third temple, but not in Jerusalem.
Right, they suggest building it in eastern Donbass, of all places.
Which is, as you know, currently in the middle of a pretty intense conflict.
And they envision this temple as being specifically for the Gentiles. They reference that verse from Romans that says, God is the God of the Gentiles too.
So it's a very different understanding of the temple and its purpose.
Absolutely. And they connect it to the mustard seed vision of the kingdom of heaven, this idea that something small can grow into something huge and all-encompassing.
Okay, so the sources also touch on some wider global trends, like the impact of offshore manufacturing and the growing influence of China. How do they tie those into their overall message?
Well, they express concern about the shift in values they see happening both in the U.S. and in China, and they warn about the potential for a kind of communist fascist empire to emerge, which is language that echoes the book of Revelation.
So it's like they're placing this whole Project Abraham within this larger context of a spiritual battle playing out on a global scale.
Exactly. And they argue that the only way to resist these negative trends is through spiritual renewal, ethical technology, and decentralized governance.
Okay, so AI pops up again, this time in the context of political discourse and the future of work.
Right. They talk about using AI, specifically ChatGPT, to analyze political debates, like the one between Walz and Vance.
So AI as a political analyst. Interesting.
And they also discuss the use of AI in industries like dockworking, but with important caveat. They emphasize that AI should be used to enhance human capabilities, not replace human workers.
So it's a vision of AI and humans working together in a kind of partnership.
Exactly.
The sources also bring up the recent ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas and the release of the hostages. That's pretty timely.
Yeah, and they acknowledge that both President Biden and former President Trump are trying to take credit for these developments. But the way they frame it is interesting. They suggest that ultimate credit should actually go to God.
So again, it all comes back to this idea of a larger divine plan at work.
Precisely.
Let's circle back to that core idea of shared Abrahamic heritage. Why is that so crucial to their whole vision?
Because it's about highlighting those fundamental connections that bind these faiths together. They constantly refer to the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran, showing how they all share similar stories, similar values.
And they specifically point to Quran 21.105, which says, God's righteous servant shall inherit the earth, and how it echoes Psalm 37.
Exactly. It's about finding that common ground and using it as the foundation for building bridges.
The sources also talk a lot about fear and the role it plays in this conflict. What's their take on that?
They see fear as this incredibly destructive force. It damages the human spirit. It blocks us from experiencing God's love. They even reference George Orwell's 1984 to illustrate how fear can be used as a tool of control and manipulation.
And they contrast that with the call to love our enemies, which is a pretty radical idea, especially in the context of a conflict like this.
Right, but that's really the heart of their message, that love is the only true antidote to fear and hatred.
And this brings us back to that whole idea of jihad. It's such a loaded term, so it's important to understand how they're defining it.
Right, because they're using it in a very specific way. They define jihad as a peaceful internal struggle. A struggle against our own ego, our own selfish desires.
So it's about self-improvement, about becoming more aligned with God's will.
Exactly. And they argue that this understanding of jihad is not only compatible with democracy, it's actually essential for it.
Interesting. Because it suggests that true peace has to start within each of us individually before it can manifest in the world around us.
That's a great way to put it.
So how do they view the current situation in the Holy Land?
They frame it as a test for the Abrahamic faith community to demonstrate true love and mercy. And they warn that there will be consequences if we fail this test.
No, the stakes are high.
Absolutely. And they keep coming back to that point that any lasting solution has to come from the people who actually live in the Holy Land. No one else can impose peace from the outside.
Okay, so what about the two-state solution? That's something that's been discussed for decades. What do the sources have to say about that?
Well, they're pretty critical of it. They argue that it may have actually made things worse in some ways.
How so?
They suggest that it's created more inequality for Palestinians, and they also criticize U.S. foreign policy, especially the way aid has been handled.
So they're basically calling for a rethink of the whole approach.
Yeah. They're saying that we need to be willing to consider alternatives. And they point to historical examples of peaceful coexistence between Jews and Muslims to show that it's not an impossible dream.
And they specifically reference the Quran's use of the term people of the book to describe Jews and Christians.
Exactly. It's a sign of respect, a recognition of shared heritage.
Now let's talk about the Temple Mount. That's obviously a hugely sensitive and complex issue. What perspective do the sources offer?
They actually raise the possibility of rebuilding the Second Temple, but in a way that respects the existing Islamic holy sites. They talk about shared secret space, which is a pretty radical idea.
It is. It would require a huge amount of trust and cooperation.
No doubt about it. And they bring in this interesting analogy, the biblical story of the judgment of Solomon.
How does that relate?
Well, they present it as a metaphor for the kind of wisdom and discernment we need to find a solution to this conflict. They point out that Solomon was willing to compromise, even though it meant going against what some people consider to be absolute truth.
So it's about finding creative solutions, even if it means letting go of some of our cherished beliefs or positions.
Exactly. Because ultimately, the goal is peace. And sometimes peace requires sacrifice.
Okay, last but not least, they bring up former President Trump's proposals regarding Gaza.
Yeah, specifically his idea of the U.S. taking over and turning it into a lush tropical Riviera. But the sources contrast that vision with a more spiritual vision for the Holy Land.
A vision that's more about inner transformation than external development.
Right. And they also mention Hamas's rejection of the proposal and the potential for military intervention if hostages weren't released.
So a lot of different perspectives and potential outcomes at play there.
Absolutely.
But we have certainly covered a lot of ground today. From AI to ancient prophecies, from spiritual battles to the potential for a new era of peace.
Yeah, this has been one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet.
So many unexpected ideas, like inviting HTS leaders to participate in a peace initiative or building a third temple in eastern Donbas. It really challenges us to think outside the box.
It does.
Yeah.
And it highlights the sheer complexity of this issue.
So as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. If you could take just one step, what would it be to bring lasting peace to the Holy Land? And what role could our shared faith traditions play in making that step a reality? I encourage you to explore the sources we've discussed today, dig deeper into the ideas that resonated with you, and see where it takes you. This is a conversation that needs to continue, and I hope you'll join us in keeping it going.